Welcome to this to the next session of the online training within the Climate Resilient and Inclusive Cities project, co-founded by the European Commission, the European Union, sorry. We have the topic now, planning for climate action and improved urban environment. And within the next 1.5 hours, we are going to have several presentations, discussions, and interviews. And I would like to introduce now the team or the speakers of this session. First, John Echlin. He's a principal urban planner based in Switzerland, so far I know. Echlin Planning Advisory. And Federico Eili, he is a project manager researcher at the ISOCARP Institute. And both are going to address and develop the topic of environmental development. So I would like to give the floor now to John Echlin, and he will take over and present the content of the course. John, this is your turn now.
Let me just get my audio. Thank you, Didier. And good afternoon, everyone. Salamat siang and salam alaikum from Switzerland. I'm John Echlin. I'm an urban planner and member of ISOCARP. And I'll take you through our course outline this afternoon. First, we're going to look at our learning objectives, and then I'll be presenting some theory. And essentially, case studies will be presented by Federico. We'll also be looking at some tools and methods, some useful resources and references, and then last but not least, we'll cover some questions. We'll have some questions for you and our takeaway lessons for today. Let's see, next. Learning objectives. So we're looking at city climate action and the environment. And essentially what we want to understand, we put this together. We didn't have the benefit of your questions this morning. I've noted some of your concerns down, and we'll try and address those as we present. But essentially, we put this program together as somewhat for a general audience. It doesn't get too technical, but at the same time, we want to cover a number of topics. We want to cover the drivers and impacts of climate change on cities, understanding climate risk, vulnerability, some key terms regarding mitigation, adaptation, resilience, and then understanding different approaches to climate change planning. Also, something on the process, the tools available. We're going to be showing the case studies, and then we'll give you a good overview of some climate change resources to use in your planning. So first on to the theory. Cities and climate change. We know that the science community has concluded that human activities are changing the Earth's climate very quickly in ways that increase risk to cities. This is based on many different types of evidence and historical record and changes to the climate record and emerging patterns of new extremes, and also on the new tools available in terms of climate modeling. Cities and people everywhere are experiencing these effects. This is not something off in the future. This is happening today. So understanding and anticipating these changes will help us prepare for a more sustainable future. This chart just shows some of the projected temperature changes by 2050, trying to just reach the target of 1.5 centigrade set by the Paris Agreement. And we know impacts. You see the green dots, some of the major cities that are lying mostly at the moderate climate belt. Some of the major impacts are going to be this rise of global temperature, certainly the extreme weather events, flooding, droughts, storms that will be increased. Increased temperatures is going to add to the heat island effect on cities. Sea level rise in coastal locations and flooding in inland locations. That's also going to lead to a secondary impact, which is going to be the migration of climate refugees, people fleeing these areas and going to population centers. And we're also going to see the increase of tropical diseases, such as we now have with COVID. It's very much related to our relationship to the environment and the growth of cities within natural areas. So all of these impacts are going to have very costly impacts on cities' basic services, their infrastructure, their housing, and health. This just shows the relationship between the changes in temperature on the left-hand side and 3 different cities around the globe. Interestingly enough, the impacts in Paris are far greater at a lower temperature than even New York or a city in China, Kunshan. The main point being here is that climate change is a global phenomena, and these changes are happening globally, whether it's Europe, Asia, or America. As we saw before, we have the Sustainable Development Goals, and essentially with the Sustainable Development Goals, 2015 was a very important year. They were created to create a blueprint to achieve better and more sustainable future for all. And in particular, what's important under this topic of cities and the environment are the 2, goal number 11 and goal number 13, making cities and human settlements inclusive, safe, and resilient. And number 15, taking urgent action to combat climate change and its impacts by regulating emissions, promoting developments in renewable energy. So just to go into some of these impacts and how they're affecting cities with regard to global urbanization in the 21st century. This chart shows the population, the shift of population from 2000 to 2030 in cities, particularly in Asia and developing countries. You can see that the growth of population is 2 or 3 times what it was in 2000. The UN Habitat predicts by 2050 it will be close to 70% of world population will be living in cities. So there's a steady migration to cities as they become more and more the economic drivers and agriculture becomes more mechanized. And cities will bear a greater risk because of this higher concentration of people, assets, and resources. This shows the impacts of the growth of these population centers in these biodiversity hotspots. And it was mentioned before, the impacts we're having currently with epidemics and pandemics. This is a direct result of cities growing within these biodiversity hotspots. It's a phenomena that we really have to pay attention to, which we haven't, let's say, as much before. Cities need to start looking at how to limit their growth patterns within these areas and to start to look at how to be more inclusive of biodiversity within the city infrastructure itself. This shows the relationship between the coastal populations and essentially the majority of cities that are really along coastlines, especially Asian cities, China, India, Japan, Indonesia. A majority of population is within a danger zone, essentially, of sea level rise. And we know, for instance, in Jakarta, there's the doubling effect, not only of sea level rise due to land subsidence, but also due to the harvesting of groundwater for drinking. So what are some of the main drivers? These are some of the main impacts we saw. What are some of the main drivers in cities? Things to keep in mind, the economic base. What is the economy of a city? Is it mainly dependent on manufacturing, industry, services, whatever it might be? What is the carbon intensity of that sector, that particular sector? Fossil fuel based, to what degree? What kind of fossil fuels are being used? What is the transportation sector, for instance? And is it also fossil fuel based? What are the individual consumption lifestyles and citizen behavior patterns? Do citizens prefer private cars or public transport? There was a question earlier, I think in this morning session, about the use of motorbikes as opposed to public transport. Certainly it's a cheaper alternative, but it does have its carbon intensity, its carbon impacts. Can people walk to work or do they need to commute? Certainly one of the basic questions and which really influences the topic of urban form. the shape of the city, how close are people to their workplaces, and what is the density of that urban form. And lastly, what are the energy patterns related to weather conditions? Is it a cold northern dry climate, or is it a southern climate requiring air conditioning? Every city is different. I think that's the main point here. Every city is going to have its particular drivers, and no two cities are alike. I'm sure that's also the case in Indonesia. This just shows, explains some of the CO2 emissions of 4 main sectors: energy, agriculture, forestry, and waste, and the differences in different countries. You can see on the left-hand side that in the US, the primary emitter is the energy sector, the generation of power through fossil fuels, whether it be coal or gas or oil. Whereas Indonesia, the main emitter is actually due to deforestation, and the actual carbon generation of burning forests is the greatest generator. Here we have, this just explains about urban form and greenhouse gas emissions. Essentially that there's a direct relationship. On this chart, on the right-hand side, you see that there's cities which are of a lower density tend to produce less greenhouse gases, whereas cities that are of a higher density produce more, and even greater among cities that have both a high density and spread out over broad areas. These have a very high carbon growth pattern. Cities in the US and Canada are especially like this. The diagram on the left really illustrates that. The cities of Atlanta and Barcelona are quite similar in population, around 2.5 million. But essentially Atlanta has up to 30 times the size of Barcelona and produces 10 times the amount of carbon. So we've looked at some of the impacts. We've looked at some of the relationships, the essential relationships with cities. One way to think of impacts is both as direct and primary, and then indirect and secondary. Direct and primary impacts are really what happens when a disaster strikes. A natural disaster creates casualties, and there may be other things such as famines or economic loss, which are immediate, but there are also indirect secondary impacts, which are a longer term result, and they sometimes may be multiple impacts. Just illustrating this is a diagram that shows how a climate hazard such as flooding or sea level rise can lead to an immediate direct impact, but there may be multiple secondary impacts that happen because of that. So looking at cities and impacts, we really want to then encapsulate it within this terminology we call vulnerability, a city's vulnerability. And essentially what vulnerability is how a city plans for climate change. It's going to depend greatly on its degree of vulnerability. To define it, vulnerability is a function of the character, the ability of a system to really adapt to climate variation. What is its sensitivity? What is its adaptive capacity? A city may be have a great deal of adaptive capacity, the degree to which it can reduce exposure or sensitivity, or a city may have a very low adaptive capacity, an inability to access technology, information, or resources to mitigate the potential impact. Vulnerabilities represent threats over time. And certainly, as we're understanding vulnerabilities today, the current time period, present day, some of these examples, we have extreme heat and the effects on poverty, water availability, food security. These are going to increase over time. Certainly with extreme heat, today it affects a certain population. we know over time by the 2050s, it's going to impact a much greater population. And what's important in this, similar to what we heard this morning in Martina's presentation, urban planning has made a shift in terms of understanding vulnerability from being one about infrastructure and environment to being one about social exposure. That in essence, what we're talking about in vulnerability is not only the infrastructure, the pipes, the streets, the roads, the connections that are really exposed to hazards, environmental hazards. What we're talking about now is really social vulnerability, social groups that have different characteristics and exposure to climate change, and what we can do to include these groups within the planning process. And one of the keys to that is disaster risk management. Disaster risk management was also created around the time of the Sustainable Development Goals as a way of dealing with the loss of lives and livelihoods due to natural disasters. There's the UN Office for Disaster Risk Reduction, and they've created a framework, the Sendai framework, to work hand in hand with the UN SDGs. So it's really a matter of avoiding construction of new risks, addressing pre-existing risks, and essentially looking at social vulnerability as one of the primary aspects of sustainability today. So that's to a few of the key terms that we want to be looking at in putting together a climate action plan. So cities will continue to be a primary magnet for human population. There's going to be essentially a number of actions that cities need to take. The two main actions, mitigation and adaptation, are what we need to build towards climate resilience. Mitigation, I think many of you may know already, it's really the ability to improve energy efficiency, performance, and reduce CO2 emissions. Adaptation, we know, is all about adjusting an actual or process to an expected climate effect. In human systems, it means seeking or moderating to avoid or be exposed to these effects. And both of these, mitigation and adaptation, build toward what we call resilience. And it's important to keep both of these aspects in mind. We need both mitigation and adaptation. It's become an essential component of urban policy and urban planning. We know there's a direct relationship between mitigation, adaptation, and climate change impacts. Reducing these impacts early on today is going to reduce the costs in the future. So climate change planning, mitigation, and adaptation has really become the new driver of city form. In searching for new solutions, essentially urban systems, we're looking at urban systems to become the new ways of dealing with CO2 emissions and adapting to climate-related disruptions. We're looking at urban form, how they can contribute to climate livability without reliance on fossil fuels. We're looking at buildings and their ability to resist heat and reduce energy demands. We're looking at cities as a whole to increase vegetative cover to deal with CO2 impacts. Resilience, I think most of you know definitions of resilience. I won't go too far into that, but what we want to talk about, and this is where I'll start to close out, is just a process for dealing and implementing climate change planning. So there's three approaches really in dealing with and implementing mitigation and adaptation as it approaches to resilience. There's ad hoc planning, focusing on technical specifications, addressing one specific opportunity. Climate is the main goal. A good example is stormwater management. It's often looked at as a single solution to a project. It's quick to implement it, implement, and it has limited stakeholder involvement. But it doesn't necessarily address all the other issues comprehensively. Strategic planning is a response to this, not just looking at things ad hoc, but looking at things comprehensively, integrating policies, providing clear implementation path, and actually using extensive stakeholder involvement. Mainstreaming is really an approach to look at existing programs and how can climate change issues be addressed in existing programs. There's advantages and disadvantages to each of these approaches. And in reality, all three approaches are going to be used in climate change planning. The UN has a very useful guidebook on climate change planning, and they essentially encapsulate a process which early on involves defining what the issues are, getting stakeholder commitment, developing a communications plan, and then really tackling both these issues together, mitigation and adaptation, before leading to identifying and prioritizing actions. It also gives you a set of principles which are very useful in developing a plan. And some of these principles are about inclusivity. Actually, as we talked about before, the social inclusiveness of disadvantaged populations. Also being ambitious, being fair, being comprehensive and integrated, being relevant to your city and your particular problems. Making sure that whatever actions you have are evidence-based and transparent and verifiable. The UN Guidebook also gives you a real step-by-step process to follow. First, and it organizes it within a set of modules. First, identifying really what is happening, what are the particular issues that we're dealing with, getting stakeholders involved early on in the process, identifying what the vulnerabilities are that you're facing, looking at what matters most, the issues and objectives, what is it we're trying to achieve on a long-term basis. Then looking at options and implementation. Implementation is often the greatest barrier. It was talked about this morning a bit in one of the questions. How do we overcome the barriers of implementation? And that has a lot to do with management of the process itself. It needs to be monitored and evaluated, and it needs to adjust and modify over time. And so think of it as a circular process. The process of planning for climate adjustment is really about two overlapping systems. On the one hand, on the left-hand side, you have the urban system, looking at climate risks, dealing with those, looking at particular hazards that may occur, letting that feed into a planning cycle, and letting the planning cycle assess those climate risks, developing adaptation approaches, options, and a plan, and then feeding that back into the real world, where things can be tested and adjusted, and really further refined, so that it's a never-ending process, really, of planning. It's not just creating a plan up front and then implementing. It's also about the long-term following up and really management of those actions over time. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Federico to introduce the case studies, and then we'll go on with some resources and questions. Federico.
Thank you very much, John, for the great overview, and I hope you can all hear me properly. If something goes wrong, just try to let me know. I would like to, in the second part of the presentation, we would like to introduce briefly a few case studies in order to see what actually cities are doing and what cities can do in terms of climate mitigation, adaptation, and resilience. We selected a few cases from all over the country, all over the world, from different contexts, and we will quickly go through one by one without focusing, due to the limited time, on technical details, but we will just focus on the main ideas and the principles behind them. We can start with a project realized in the city of Porto, in Portugal, in Europe, dealing with one of the most adverse effects of climate change in cities, the urban heat island effect. And in this case, they relies on a public space, green roof, basically, a public space and a green public space on top of this building. There are several examples. You can easily find them all over the world, and they can be, the idea of green roofs can be easily applied also on private buildings, and they are also an excellent way to develop and to implement ideas such as community gardens and to promote urban agriculture inside cities. As you can see here, the benefit, of course, is there are several studies showing how the green elements and green surfaces can reduce the temperature of up to some degrees in cities, increasing the quality of the urban environment. And then in this specific case, there is also of course, it became a more attractive public space and urban environment, so it also fostered the possibility and the social interaction between groups and citizens. Moving on. Another example here, we are in Brazil, in Rio de Janeiro, and we are focusing on the renewable energies. So clearly, as we saw before, energies is one of the main issues and one of the main drivers of climate changes in cities all over the world. And in this example, Rio de Janeiro was one of the first Brazilian cities trying to implement a network of smart grids and sustainable energies, essentially mainly based on solar panel, and create a decentralized smart grid program. What I want to highlight here is the importance of regulations and policies. We do not take climate changes only with designing physical interventions, but a large part of action also depends on how we implement and we develop policies and regulations. For example, in Rio, there are quite strict regulations, for example, about the requirements for energetic efficiencies in new buildings and the renewed buildings. A next case, here we are in China. And this is an area, as you can see, at the confluence of two rivers that was kind of underdeveloped wetland with some concrete walls around it. And here the municipality had the vision, the ideas to realize and to transform it into a large public space accessible to the population, to the citizens. As you can see, the park has, the area has been transformed in a water-resilient terrain. So it constitutes clearly a device for water management and disaster risk reduction, allowing the water to, giving space to the water. And the careful design of the park based on multi-levels gives also the opportunity to people to visit the park and to be there also when the park is partially covered by the water, when the river are flooding. Creating also not only clearly environmental benefits, but also creating a kind of dynamic of resilient and dynamic landscape and the dynamic relations between the people, the man and nature, we could say. Let's move on now to an example maybe closer to you. We found this reference from Wageningen University and from EcoShape, but we are sure there are also some other projects dealing with mangroves restorations. And here the principle is planting mangroves, using mangroves to protect and to reduce the coastal erosions. So it's really an approach, an idea of building with nature, recognizing, acknowledging, and exploiting the various performances that natural features can meet. I think you also know probably better than me that there are probably also some other benefits related to mangroves restorations. They are beneficial to the local ecosystems. They can also somehow contribute to developing maybe local fisheries and also local tourism. Let's now move to an example related to the transportation sector, and we are in Curitiba, which is a city in Brazil, and probably the first city in Brazil who implemented a quite efficient bus rapid transit system. What is it, a bus rapid transit system? It is basically constituted of roadways that are basically where basically buses can travel, moving population, moving people without being separated by the cars, so improving the speed and efficiency. Of course, it is a kind of system that you can imagine is far less expensive than an underground system. And so it is quite effective in cities up to a certain size. However, here what I would like to point out is the clear relation between urban density and the public transport. And this is also the idea that underlying the principle of TOD, of transit-oriented development. The idea that the most dense area, the most populated areas of the cities have to be also the one more connected to the public transport in order to allow the highest number possible of people to commute, to travel, and to move inside the cities in a sustainable way. Another example, here we are back in Europe, in Copenhagen. This is a very interesting approach developed after really extreme events which took place in Copenhagen in 2011. The municipality reacted after that, and they start thinking out of the box, and they developed a new concept and a new approach, integrating blue-green solutions, blue-green infrastructures, and they developed a surface first approach. So they decided to deal with water management at the surface level, and not just anymore on the pipe systems. And so they develop a kind of master plan and a series of toolkits and a series of design solutions which are quite comprehensive, which include public spaces, but which also tackle, for example, traffic reductions, traffic limitations, and of course, water infiltration. And to conclude this short section about some case studies, one of the major issues we also saw is the sea level rise. And recall what we saw at the beginning of the presentation: the largest cities in the world are all coastal cities. So this is an issue which has to be seriously taken into account. New York, as Copenhagen, experienced quite some critical events. One example is the Hurricane Sandy in 2012, and the peculiarity is that these events are starting to repeating more frequently. And so they decided to invest and to try to redesign and rethink the riverfront of the waterfront of the city. engaging also community and acknowledging that vulnerable residents live there and that some of the most critical assets of the cities are basically located very close to the water. And so they are creating the opportunity for designing with permeable materials, especially natural elements, creating public spaces involving communities, and for example, once again, community gardens, urban agriculture. And it is a clear example of resilience and thinking, anticipating, and how to react and how to prepare to adverse climate events which could take place in the future. Now we would like to present a few methods and tools which we have selected. It might be a bit heterogeneous, but we cannot. There are several topics which we could present, but we needed to be a bit selective. But we just want to give you some insight and some perspective, hoping that it might contribute and it might help you in the work you are doing in your cities. Recall the climate, the process of climate action planning. So we start with an assessment, maybe a vulnerability profile, an inventory of greenhouse gas emissions, and then we develop some approach and we try to understand which option could be effectively implementable. However, the critical point comes when we need to decide which actions to implement, the so-called prioritization process. And that's why we need somehow a decision support system. So we need to take decision, and this implies a responsibility. This implies that it's not neutral what we're going to decide and which measure we are going to decide to implement. The decision support systems really refer to the criterias and what criterias are important, which consideration we want to take into account while we have to take decisions. Without being too much complex, we just present you a few examples. Cost-benefit analysis, cost-effectiveness analysis, and multi-criteria analysis. And as you will see, they all refer to slightly different, they take into account slightly different criteria. The cost-benefit analysis is a systematic approach which calculates the cost and the benefits, but in a monetary term. So it only takes into consideration the monetary value. It could be positive, it could be negative, but it's only referred to the monetary value of the measure and the measure that could be implemented. The cost effectiveness analysis keeps into account the monetary values of the options we could implement, but it also tried to take into account some of the outcomes or the effects and try somehow to quantify. An example could be, for example, the implementation of some measures to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions and you compare the costs to implement this operation with the potential reduction of greenhouse gas emissions that you can achieve. Lastly, multi-criteria analysis. It is probably the most inclusive and the most inclusive process because it takes into account also the various stakeholders' perspective and their requests. And it is based on the evaluation of different criteria and different measures and options, going beyond simply the monetary values of the operations. Especially when we deal with environmental issues, it is very hard to translate environmental benefits or social, cultural benefits into a monetary value. So this is a very used and common approach also in climate change policies. A very short, quick example, hoping to give an overview and being a bit more clear. Here we see a cost-benefit analysis applied to street trees. And if you look at the details, it is all about the cost profile. So the numbers are all related to the monetary values along the life cycle of the trees. An example of a cost effectiveness analysis applied to flood risk reduction. You see here 3 different options. You see the costs, but you see the outcomes, which is also taken into account, which is the number of beneficiaries. And so the cost and the number of beneficiaries are related, and you could compare and you could find out what is the most cost-effective measure. Lastly, always in flood risk reduction, we could see an example of multi-criteria analysis, and probably the image are a bit small, but you can just see the criteria considered on the left: the cost, the effectiveness, the ease of implementation of the measure, the feasibility, and in the end, the co-benefits. And this is what I was saying before. So how can we compare, how can we include into decision also the environmental benefits which do not have necessarily a monetary value? We do not have time to go through climate finances, but just be aware when you are implementing, or you have to implement measures. So what are the options that you have, and what could be the best financial arrangement? Of course, it really depends on the local context. So I cannot. This is just an overview, and we do not really go into details now. But the invitation is really think and explore all the possibilities when you are deciding and you are looking for funding and for how to implement measures and a climate action plan. Changing topic, we would like to mention something about the approach of and the so-called nature-based solutions, which are, it is an approach which basically rely on the idea of building with nature. So using natural features, natural elements in the design of technical solutions. We saw some example before already in the case studies. The advantage is that they are different. They are a systemic approach. They are an integrated approach, and in this they differ from the more traditional gray infrastructure. In fact, they provide. They are also considered multifunctional, and they provide co-benefits. So not only climate mitigation and adaptation, but they contribute to human health and to social and economical development. They are also locally adaptable, they are more flexible, and they are closely related to the notion of ecosystem services. So the idea is that ecosystems can provide a variety of services, for example, especially food. They can provide food, for example, or they can regulate in the clean air, they can support cultural activities and renewable process of natural renewal. Here it is the definition given by the European Research and Innovation Agenda. I just focus on a solution inspired and supported by nature, and which simultaneously provide environmental, social, and economic benefits, and that to build resilience. Lastly, we have a video contribution by Joachim Bergerhoff about sustainable transportation. And more specifically, the approach is intermodality.
Good day. Greetings from Phnom Penh, Cambodia. My name is Bergerhoff Joachim. I am the team leader of an ASEAN-German cooperation project called SUMMER, Sustainable Mobility in Medium-Sized Metropolitan Regions. Our role is to assist national and local governments in ASEAN in setting up governance structures that are able to anticipate, create and organize sustainable transport solutions at metropolitan scales. Intermodal interchange hubs are a key topic in our project. Today, allow me to give you a quick introduction. Intermodality is the interconnection of several modes of transport when making a journey from A to B. Intermodality is an individual strategy for journey optimization. Travelers will interconnect several transport modes if this allows to travel faster, safer, more conveniently, or cheaper than by any one single mode of transport alone. Intermodality is also a collective strategy for the optimization of entire transport systems. By the way, intermodality is part of the broader concept of multimodality. Multimodality does not necessarily interconnect several modes of transport during the same journey. It proposes to choose between different modes for each journey. There is one virtual integration of fundamental importance: integrated planning and design, precisely because they eventually create the material foundations for a well-functioning transport system overall, and for intermodality in particular. To meet these challenges, there are three sets of tools in the Avoid, Shift, Improve toolbox. Shift to sustainable modes of transport by creating effective, attractive walking and cycling networks, local bus networks, long-distance BRT and rail corridors. Avoid many and long trips by locating activities, housing, work, education, retail, leisure in the vicinity of these networks. Match the mobility profile of each activity with the accessibility profile of each location. This is the logic of the Dutch ABC planning guideline and of the 15 minutes neighborhood concept. The objective is to make as many activities as possible easily accessible by convenient, sustainable, monomodal journeys. Improve, finally, the interconnections between all transport networks through excellent physical designs and smooth transfer processes. A bonus trick is to cut the trip chains of long intermodal journeys into a succession of several short monomodal journeys. That is, to transform interchange hubs into intermediate destinations, provide services, hospitality, shopping that make it useful and even pleasant to stop over at interchange hubs. This leads to the concept of TOD, transit-oriented development. Through integrated planning of transport, land use and localization of activities, public transport stations and in particular intermodal interchange hubs generate much activity and generate much footfall. This makes interchange hubs locations of high commercial value. This value constitutes the economic foundation for the implementation and the operation of the intermodal transport systems that have created them. So much for a brief introduction to intermodality and its relationship with several other concepts of urban and regional planning. Please be in touch through the website summer.asia for further and deeper discussion about this topic.
And to conclude, we just would like to present you and to mention some of the references we have seen and we have used during our presentation. You see, we have collected them in guidebooks, in frameworks and toolkits, and in references and case studies. So we really invite you to spend some time and look for more information and for more
all of these
more inspiration.
I'll just add, Federico, all of these are available online. You just need to enter the information you see here and you can find links to them. And they're all publicly available tools and guidebooks, usually in PDF form in English. So.
Yes. And we also have, as in the other presentations, we also have some references from our ISOCARP reviews. There are very interesting articles on different topics, from resilience to food systems. And also we have references from ISOCARP Congress. That concludes my presentation. I can give back the floor to John and Didier, and then we will be open to answer to some questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Federico, and thank you for the presentation. And I've been jotting down the questions that have been coming over the chat. Some very interesting and important questions, and a lot of questions about urban flooding and the relationship between urban development and urban flooding. A lot of questions about process, the difference between adaptation and mitigation. And let's see, shall we just go right into that, DDA? How would you like to do this?
Yes, John, I think that's a very good start. So we can, I did the same approach. So I different questions, and they are a lot related to the climate action plan. The climate action plan related to the urban plan. So how can we implement the climate action, well, the climate implementation measures related to the urban planning? How is it with the old infrastructure? Is it still valid? For example, old canals from previous years, is it still valid? How can we increase green space when we need land for housing? How can we measure that? So what kind of measures can we use? What kind of measurement system? What kind of factors can we use? So maybe the first questions.
Okay, so let's take it one by one, right? Each one could be a seminar on itself. Implementing the action plan. Just to go back maybe to, if you can remember the slide about the three different approaches, the ad hoc approach, the strategic planning approach, and the mainstreaming approach. It sounds to me like this is coming from a situation where there's maybe already a kind of infrastructure, if you will, of people and organization within the city that is already working on problems. And maybe the best approach might be a mainstreaming approach, not to try and create a new department or a new, let's say, branch called climate change planning, but actually, how can you start to look within your existing sectors, whether it's public works, whether it's transport, housing, what are the key issues that you're currently experiencing with climate change? And you really have to, in a way, you have to break down the barriers. You have to break down the silos of those individual departments. You have to get people to talk to each other. Planning is all about communication, and it's all about people really meeting and addressing real problems. Once you get into an implementation stage, once you start to look at how can you actually solve these problems, then you can somewhat go back to your silos. You can go back, and those departments that deal with infrastructure can deal with infrastructure. Those that deal with housing can deal with housing. But you need that initial planning stage to really have people work as a whole team, as a whole environment, and really try and define for yourselves. As we said earlier, the issues of climate change are very, very individual to each city. Some cities are going to be experiencing it more in terms of flooding. Some cities will be experiencing it maybe in terms of heat, increase of heat and drought, temperature, loss of fresh water. There may be issues of, as we saw before, or we heard one of the questions about housing and open space. You have a desire for more open space. How do you do that when you also have a real demand for housing? Sometimes looking at these problems together can present solutions which you won't see if you just look at individually. Going to one of the questions about the riverbank, for instance, how do you start to plan a riverbank for flooding? Well, one of the strategies that's being used today, more and more, instead of channelizing that riverbank and putting it within a hard concrete edge, is to use a nature-based solution, something that Federico talked about. Actually using the landscape and letting the landscape, the soft edge, really adapt to flooding. That can also provide a solution for open space and the need for people to actually have green open space. This was the solution we saw in Copenhagen, that a park, an open space, should really serve double duty. It shouldn't just be designed strictly for recreation and sports. It also needs to have the factor of stormwater management included in it. So I would say, you know, to the process, implementing action plans, look at how you can overlap and look at how you can solve these problems collaboratively.
There was also a question related to sea level rise.
Right.
Especially when we are talking about the 17,000 islands in Indonesia and cities, urban development along the coasts.
Yeah.
What do we do when we have sea level rise, and especially small villages without any protection systems or measures?
Yeah, yeah. It's a huge question, and I've never been to Indonesia. I would love to come and experience it. You know, it's a situation. It's becoming a global situation, and certainly Indonesia is going to be one of the places most affected by sea level rise. Places which are currently looking at it and developing plans are looking at 3 different strategies. There's really 3 different ways to address this problem, and we couldn't even get into this. One is protect, obviously, your core assets. What do you have along a shoreline which you need to protect? Maybe it's certain infrastructure, a power station, or it's a port that needs to be protected. You then have really the strategy to adapt or to adjust and allow when seas rise, can you have your development actually adjust to that? Maybe you lift things up above the waterline. Maybe you build buildings at a higher level so that when the seas do come in, they essentially don't impact those structures as much. There's going to be a lot of discussion about the 3rd strategy, which is retreat. And this is probably the safest strategy, which is actually to do an assessment of what the impacts will be in the future, and then to pick a point, and maybe it has to be gradual, where development actually has to retreat beyond that point. So we're going to be looking at around the world. Certainly island nations that are most affected will be looking at this. But protect, adjust, and retreat are really the 3 strategies dealing with sea level rise. Yeah.
Excellent, thank you. So this assessment can be done quite easily. You know, there are several scenarios also produced by IPCC, etc., about sea level rise, about the next 25 years. They're going to have 2 meters higher level of you know, sea level, etc. So this can be done, I think, quite easily. We have 2 questions from the audience. First, I would like to ask Mr. Shafiq al-Islam to activate the video, and a short question, please.
My question is, what would be the strategy to increase the blue zone economy, green zone, to protect urban biodiversity and environmental sustainability as well?
So what would be if I heard that, what would be the economic strategy to protect the resources as well as
Yes.
the natural resources as well as offer opportunities? Look, it's essentially what's happening is this climate change paradigm that we're all experiencing is becoming a new driver, not only a driver of planning, but also a driver of economies. And we have to look at strategies of mitigation and strategies of adaptation also to drive the economy. Mitigation can be such things as tree planting. It can be such things as in Bangladesh, you have the mangroves. The mangrove restorations, I'm sure, is a huge topic right now. That will do double duties. That's going to help not only to sequester more greenhouse gases, it's also going to help to prevent sea level impacts, sea level rise impacts. That can also be an economic incentive for mangrove planting, for instance, because it can employ people. It can actually employ local villagers and actually be a way of making an income. It has to be supported by the government, but it is a way of generating some economic activity. Maybe there can be some harvesting related to that, which could then generate income when things are harvested as well. Adaptation is also a path towards economic development. And a number of companies are being started to look at this in particular. Mitigation and adaptation, you could say, if you look at these two strategies in and of themselves, can help generate economic activity.
Okay, thank you, John. There is another question from Shansul Alam. Please.
Thank you very much for, yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
Hello? Oh.
Yes.
Thank you very much for giving me the floor again. I'd like to thank the presenters for their valuable presentation. So one presentation we have seen the highest level of carbon is coming from the countries, from the top level, USA, China, Indonesia, Brazil, Russia, and such like this order. And this highest level of carbon emission actually causing the high temperature rise. And at the end of the day, rise is being increasing, and like Indonesia, like Bangladesh, the southern part of Bangladesh is going underwater during the monsoon time. And by this time, when I'm talking, our municipal, some parts of our municipal area is going underwater, and our honorable mayor is visiting in that area at time. So my question is, climate action plan. So all kinds of activities, all kinds of process involving the community people, involving the citizen, involving the CBOs, involving the another development groups, or all things is okay. At the end of the day, we are getting a good plan, but a good plan without implementation is quite meaningless. If we don't have enough money and we could not implement that plan, it is actually meaningless. So my question is on this point. These countries are producing more and more carbon for their benefit, for their economic and social development, and they are when responsibility lies with them. They are creating so much carbons which are causing effects on us, as because their carbon is not confined on their own soil. There is no boundary of carbon, so the carbon is coming to us, and we are affected. But at the end of the day, they are not agreed to pay for this. How this problem can be solved?
Good question.
This is my question.
Yes, thank you so much. Thank you for. So, John, this to give you the floor to.
I think this might be above my pay grade, but it's a question. Obviously, it's probably the single biggest question that anybody's facing today. We all recognize that Western, more developed countries are really the major problem, and they have been based. The last 100 years of development have been based on carbon-based economies. Let's face it. We didn't know these impacts 20 years ago, 50 years ago. Suddenly it's hitting everyone in the face. And I share your frustration, I really do. It's something, you know, as an urban planner, I can only work on urban planning projects. I'm not able to work at the national level, let's say. But there are people who are, obviously, and I know there's the UN in particular as an organization is looking at that. I did want to mention that the UN has, in order that the Sustainable Development Goals are not just a plan. As you mentioned, it's great to come up with plans, but how do we implement them? There are a number of financing mechanisms which have been developed. The UN in particular has created the Green Climate Fund to help implement projects, finance projects on an international basis. The World Bank, the Asian Development Bank, there's a number of private institutions as well and foundations which are also funding climate-related projects. So I think the resources are there. I would suggest you're not going to solve the problem at the global level unless you start somewhere locally. What is your local problem? And try and make that your focus to pull those, let's say, national and hopefully international resources into bear.
Yeah. Yes. Thank you. Well, I think this is more on the national and more on the international and global level that these kind of solutions have to be found, right? And as policies have to be found. There are several questions also in the chat, and this is related to existing infrastructure, in particular the canals, so the old water canals we have from previous predecessors. Are they still valid? I mean, the question is, should we keep this infrastructure? I think yes, but this is maybe your answer. Should we keep them, and how can we develop, and how can we keep the same infrastructure and develop another infrastructure on top of that? So maybe related to flood management, of course. Yeah.
Well, we saw at least, well, a couple of the examples. Certainly the one in Copenhagen, we picked as an example of an approach which the traditional infrastructure was designed for a flood which only occurred every 50 years, let's say. And by piping all the water underground, it didn't anticipate the degree of flooding that we have today. But you don't throw out the old system. But you also don't dig it up and create bigger pipes, because that's going to be extremely costly. It's going to be very disruptive. And what really needs to be done, and what's being looked at today, is this nature-based solution. Was the former, the really approach, looking at a hard engineering approach. Today we're looking at more green and blue. It's called green-blue infrastructure. How can we start to deal with flooding at the surface, creating areas, let's say retention areas for flooding that can also serve other urban purposes, such as parks, designing streets in such a way that streets can actually flood on the surface to a certain extent, perhaps raising buildings to a degree so they're not damaged, and let the previous system coexist. But it's not going to be rebuilt strictly as a pipe-based system any longer. This is something that all cities are going through today. Luckily, the good news is, if you're in a city that is low density, you do have more area to develop for flood management than you do in cities which are very high density, which do have to find places, perhaps unused spaces, perhaps parking lots, places which are maybe derelict factories, brownfield areas, which can be converted into flood management areas. But it's a really critical problem today. All cities are facing this, and we're not just going back to the old engineered solutions any longer.
Yes. Okay. Thank you so much. There was maybe also a question also for Federico. They were questions also related to flood management, and also the contribution from the private sector. So how the private sector can be involved in terms of, well, financial contribution, maybe related to the cost analysis. I think it's quite important for Indonesian partners and for the cities in Indonesia and other part of the world, that they know exactly how far can public sector be involved in this kind of costs. Maybe you have a reply to this, or John.
Yes, I can say that clearly. It would be quite critical. Of course, the public sector cannot go everywhere. I mean, it has also limited resources, especially in certain countries. So the involvement of private sector is really crucial. And for example, yeah, it is clearly important when you are developing a climate action planning that you are trying to also to consider and to really recognize the private sector as one of the stakeholders involved. So you can try to understand what benefits they could have. It's a bit risky to say there are also some negative outcomes, but there is quite evidence that the use of nature-based solutions, ecosystem infrastructures, and ecosystem services, they increase the land value. So this is a benefit for the municipalities, clearly for the public, but it's also it can be transformed into a benefits also for the private. An issue when we come to climate finance especially this is true both for the public and the private, is the fact that green elements and natural features have really bring benefits in the long term, and most of the time there is an initial investment which is clearly negative, but you have a positive return in the long term in the sense of a future saving costs. And so one of the ideas is try to translate the future cost savings in revenues. If you wouldn't implement a specific action, you would have more expenses or damages in the long term. While you might have an initial investments, but you might see the future saving costs as a return. Another idea that I have, it's a model that could be interesting, is the one of the ESCO, the energy saving company, ISCOs, for example. This is true, for example, in the energy efficiency. Basically, companies which deliver a service of energetic efficiency, but they do not get paid at the beginning. I'm saying it in very simple words, but basically they are paid afterwards with the money that you saved from the energetic efficiency. So the future cost savings of energies can be used to cover the initial investment. And this is a formula that, yeah, in Europe especially, it has been using, and it has for sure some potentialities.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you, Federico. We have a question from Mataram City, and I would like to ask also Fikri to speak. And the question is related to waste management and how to use waste. So the process we are using, transforming waste to energy. Is it something feasible for Indonesia? And I would like to ask Fikri to ask the question precisely, and maybe you can also activate your video so we can see you and speak. So this is the question about the relationship between waste and energy and waste management. Fikri?
Thank you for giving me opportunity to talk in this forum. First of all, I already raised about this issue in Mataram on the previous forum in Jakarta, because today in Mataram we deal with a pile of waste very severely. That's why our mayor actually already set a goal to make waste to energy power plant in order to fill the energy or power in Mataram, because today in Mataram, as a small island, we rely on the 100% fossil fuel Since the early independence days, we still use the fossil fuel in Mataram. So that's why in the other part we have a source of energy that is known as waste, and the other part in the world, in Europe, we knew that it's already developed very modern waste to energy station there in Europe.
Yes.
So
yes, I will.
Between these problems, so how is it possible to create one of that in Lombok as an island? Because our island is very vulnerable. It's surrounded by the water, and we rely on the tourism industry. However, the threat exists from the waste. So that's why we need experts from you all in Europe how to deal with this.
Thank you, Fikri.
We know that it's costly, but maybe we have a solution about that. Thank you very much.
You're welcome, Fikri. And I think, John, you have, can you bring an answer to this?
Well, first, Fikri, I just want to understand, maybe the first question is what type of waste is it that you're looking at? Is it, for instance, household waste? Is it any form of industrial? I mean, are there sort of small factories that may be producing waste? Is it agricultural waste product? And depending on your answer, I think each one, household waste, any kind of production waste, or let's say agricultural waste, is going to have a different solution. There are technical solutions for all three of those to create energy. And depending upon what your particular situation is, what is it you're particularly dealing with in terms of waste?
Yep. Ricky?
Yes, most of our waste is from the household.
Okay.
So most of them are mixed between the household and offices. We don't have industry there, so it's really about the household. So
and no farming or no agriculture.
Well, we have some we have a potential waste from the agriculture.
Yeah.
Today the farmers still slash and burn the rest of the harvest things, so it's pollute the air.
Yeah.
So it's more what do you call organic waste, rather than
exactly
industrial waste.
Yeah. So I mean, a way to look at it is to step back a bit, and you're looking at the waste product, and you're looking at how to use it for energy. Another way to ask the same question might be, how can you start as an island to become more energy independent overall? You said your biggest problem is that you're importing fossil fuels. Maybe it's not only looking at waste and ways for waste to generate energy. Maybe there are other ways also to generate energy as well. Generate electricity through renewable means, for instance. Whether it's solar or whether it's wind, or in your case, being on the ocean, there may even be tidal waves and an opportunity to use the sea to generate energy. But looking at waste in particular, yes, there are ways technically to solve that and to develop waste to energy. They're very expensive, unfortunately. I know here where I live, we do have the capacity to take household waste and to turn it into energy. But first, that waste goes through a separation process. We have to separate everything out very carefully. We have to separate metals out from organic waste, which gets composted. Compost is really another source of energy, quite honestly. And it can become a resource for farming, for gardening, for other things. And then what's left over, and unfortunately today, most of that leftover is not just paper trash or wood trash, it's actually plastics. And I think it's one of the biggest problems we face today. it is incinerated and it is turned into energy. It's turned into steam, which then powers energy plants. But there is a waste product, and from that plastic, and that waste product has to be disposed of. There's no other way around it. So I would say, yes, there's a way to solve the problem, to take the waste and turn it into energy, but look at it more comprehensively, perhaps. What could be a strategy for energy independence, and really overall, what are the resources you have available to achieve that?
Yes, thank you, John.
Yep.
I think we are almost at the end. I think we have another 4 minutes for questions, and then
Didier, we also have we had three questions we wanted to post to see if we could get responses.
Okay.
Which I don't know if CRIC is still there or who's controlling it, but if it's still, is that still possible, or?
Yes, then we can.
Sure. Okay. So essentially, we wanted to hear from you. Now, obviously, we've gotten so many of your questions, and I've been writing them all down, quite honestly. I'm hoping afterwards we might be able to get back to some of you with some clearer answers. But we also just wanted to stimulate some discussion. We wanted to ask three questions. What element of environmental sustainability will be your particular city's priority? So we have a better understanding of your issues. I think we've heard already in the chat, there's some real issues around flooding, sea level rise, and so on. We wanted to see the highest potential, where do you see the highest potential for fast impact? So really, what is going to be having the most impact on your city in the future? And then what tools or approaches might you be able to apply in your city? While you're thinking about those, someone mentioned a couple of the questions earlier were about adaptation and mitigation. And I just want to go back and help explain that. Maybe you can answer these questions in the chat in the meantime. These two approaches, mitigation and adaptation, they're both very important, and it's important to think of them as essential for your city's climate plan. Mitigation, I think you can look at almost exclusively is about reducing carbon, reducing your own carbon impacts, and also perhaps doing things like tree planting or mangrove planting, which can actually help to absorb carbon within your area of control, your city itself, wherever it might be. So mitigation is about reducing carbon. And there's a certain body of technology and professionals that deal with mitigation. There's adaptation can be a whole number of things, a whole variety of things. And it's really about adapting to the impacts of climate change. If I were to go back to some examples, and I'll just go back and look at the slides I had earlier. With mitigation, certainly one example might be if you have housing, can you improve energy efficiency and reduce CO2 through a program that creates more energy efficient housing? If you're dealing with transportation, can you do something in the smart city realm to provide information online, real-time information that may include availability of public transport, car sharing, bike sharing, and help reduce reliance on private cars? These will actually, in the long run, help to reduce your carbon emissions. With adaptation, you're looking at really everything from doing planning in terms of, let's say, creating a floodplain zone, a no-build zone. You know it's going to flood. There's no point in building in that particular area. It might also be adaptation in terms of, as we mentioned before, retreating from the shoreline, actually moving houses back so they're not impacted. It may mean building or actually enhancing nature's resilience by planting, tree planting. So both of these tools are going to be very important going forward for you.
Federico or John, if you want to give some final address or final words.
No, I just want to thank you again for this opportunity to be a part of the program, and we wish you great success going forward. Hopefully, we can get back to you with some other answers to your questions. So it's been very stimulating, and we look forward to talking to you again.
Yeah, very interesting questions and very interesting discussion. So we are closing now the meeting, the session, and we will meet again tomorrow and continue with the next session on social infrastructure.